Hi everyone, and welcome to the Policy Pub, a series of videos where we will explore some capabilities of the Broadcom Layer 7 API Gateway. My name is Jay McDonald, and I'm an adoption architect with the Broadcom Layer 7 API management team. Today I'm going to discuss working with federated identity providers. Now this is a fairly long topic, so I'll be splitting this into two parts. Please make sure that you've watched Policy Pub number 2, which introduces us to federated identity providers and federated client certificate authentication. At the end of that presentation, we noted that the basic federated identity use case allows any certificate that was signed by the certificate authority to access a service, and that might not be very desirable. So in this presentation, we'll cover how we can control access to specific identities based on the certificate subject. We'll cover adding federated users to the federated identity provider, creating groups, and probably the most interesting one is creating virtual groups. So recall, in the previous presentation, we talked about how we have a certificate authority that is going to sign our certificate. We're going to load that certificate authority's public key in the form of their certificate into the Managed Certificates interface and assign it to the federated identity provider. Now when the request comes in, we're simply going to validate the certificate that it has been signed by the federated identity provider. Now in that federated identity provider, we can have several types of entities. First off is going to be a user, and a user in a FIP is simply defined by the distinguishing name that is the subject of the certificate. So adding a new user into a federated identity provider only requires the DN. Of course, once we have a few users in our FIP, we can create a group of those users for authentication. And finally, we have virtual groups, and virtual groups use a pattern match on the distinguishing name of a certificate to match it to a group. So with a virtual group, you don't need to explicitly declare users. You simply declare a pattern to match to their DN, and you end up with an authentication to a group if the DN in the certificate subject matches. So let's go to a demonstration. As before, here's our policy that we've been working with. At the end of it, we had a require SSL or TLS transport to ensure we have the certificate, and we authenticate it against the demo CA FIP. In the next screen, I have a script that I will be following with a bunch of commands, and I have my command line. Now to recap, previously, when I make a call to the gateway, any certificate that has been signed by the arbitrary-CA signing authority will be allowed into the service. So what I'm going to do is take the DN for the JMAC certificate, and I'm going to create a user in the demo FIP. And recall, all I need is the DN because it just has to match what is in the certificate. Next, I'm going to change the policy to explicitly authenticate that user. We'll go into our assertions. We'll select authenticate user or group. I'll choose the demo CA FIP and select that user. I'll remove the old authentication policy. All right. So now, when I make the call with the JMAC cert, it should still work, but since Greg T has not been added to the federated identity provider, trying to authenticate with his certificate should fail. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and speed things up and add a few other users to it. Okay, now, two of those users are based in the US, and two of the users that are in there now are based in Canada, myself and Jay Thorne. So I'm going to create a USA users group and add the two users from the USA part of it. We'll do a create group, USA users, define additional properties, set membership, we'll add Barry, and we'll add Greg. Okay. Next, I need to change my policy to authenticate to the USA users group. We'll go into our assertions, authenticate user or group, select the demo CA FIP, and there's our USA users. And I'll remove the old authentication to the JMAC specific certificate. Okay. Now recall that there are two users in that group, Greg and Barry. So if I attempt to access the service using one of their certificates, it should work. And indeed, both of them do. But if I try with anybody else, it should come back unauthorized. And this is how we use explicit groups defined in federated identity providers. Now, a very interesting use case is to create a virtual group. Now, as I mentioned before, virtual groups match a user or a certificate based on a pattern in the distinguishing name on the subject. So we're going to create a pattern using this set right here, which will allow any user whose CN matches into the Broadcom Vancouver BC CA pattern. All right. Go into our identity providers, create virtual group, Vancouver users, virtual, and the pattern for it looks like that. Note that you can use regular expressions to define this pattern. We'll click on OK. And now, actually, I think I can just make the change right here to go to the Vancouver users virtual group. And as before, if I attempt now to use somebody like Greg, who is not a member of the Vancouver users, he'll come back unauthorized. But if I call with the JMAC key, it'll work. If I try with a key for Alex Forsyth, that should work. And another user from the Vancouver office, ping. Okay, hopefully that's all clear. So in summary, federated identity providers can control access to specific identities by DN, but maintain the management by third parties' trust domain. Now, in this case, the gateway is still not having to deal with vetting the users, etc., etc. All we say is we will accept a user with a specific distinguishing name in the subject. We can create explicit groups of users, but we can also create groups based on DN pattern matching in the form of virtual groups. And this is a very powerful concept. And that concludes this episode of the Policy Pub. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, please visit the Broadcom Layer7 API management community at the URL shown. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time at the Policy Pub. Cheers.